What if her identity marvels him? Watch till the end to find out. Ethan sat quietly in the airport lounge, his expensive leather briefcase resting by his feet. He wore a sharp navy blue suit, his shoes polished to perfection, and his watch, a sleek gold timepiece, glinted in the sunlight streaming through the large windows. Ethan was used to this kind of life: first-class flights, important meetings, and constant business calls. At just 35 years old, he had already made a name for himself as one of the most successful young entrepreneurs in the tech industry. He glanced at his phone, scrolling through emails, mentally preparing for the big deal awaiting him at his destination. His company was on the brink of securing a major investment, and he couldn't afford any distractions. Everything was going according to plan, as it always did for Ethan. But today, something unusual caught his attention. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed an elderly woman struggling with her luggage. She seemed out of place in the bustling, modern airport, dressed in a simple, faded floral dress, a wide-brimmed hat perched atop her silver hair. Her hands trembled as she tried to balance her large suitcase and a stack of papers, which had begun to slip from her grasp. Passers-by hurried past her without a second glance, too absorbed in their own lives to offer any help. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. His first instinct was to ignore the situation. After all, he had his own important matters to focus on. But something inside him wouldn't let him look away. His heart tugged at him, a quiet voice urging him to act. He watched as the woman's papers finally slipped from her hands and scattered across the floor, her frustration and helplessness written all over her face. Ethan sighed and stood up, walking over to her. "Excuse me, Mom," he said, bending down to gather the scattered papers. "Do you need some help?" The old woman looked up at him with a mixture of surprise and relief. Her eyes, though weary, sparkled with kindness. "Oh, thank you, young man," she said, her voice soft but shaky. "I don't know what's gotten into me today. I'm all over the place." "No problem," Ethan replied, offering her a gentle smile as he handed her the papers. "Where are you headed? Let me help you with your luggage." The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Grace, seemed grateful for his assistance. "I'm flying to see my family," she said as Ethan helped her secure her papers and adjust her suitcase. "It's been a while since I've traveled, and everything just seems so fast these days. I must be slowing down." Ethan walked beside her toward the check-in counter, his own flight momentarily forgotten. He couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for her, despite barely knowing her. Mrs. Grace moved slowly, leaning on her cane as they made their way through the crowded terminal. Her frail appearance and quiet demeanor struck a chord in Ethan, reminding him of his own grandmother, who had passed away years ago. As they approached the counter, Mrs. Grace sighed with relief, thanking him profusely. "You're a very kind young man," she said, smiling up at him. "It's rare to find people like you these days." Ethan shrugged, brushing off the compliment. "It's no big deal," he said, but inside, he felt a warmth that he hadn't expected. In his world of business meetings and corporate negotiations, small acts of kindness were often overlooked. Yet here, helping a stranger felt good. Mrs. Grace, still smiling, looked up at him thoughtfully. "You remind me of someone," she said after a moment. "Someone I once knew a long time ago." Ethan tilted his head, curious. "Really? Who?" "Oh, it's nothing," Mrs. Grace replied, her expression softening. "Just an old memory." Ethan didn't push the subject, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her words. Mrs. Grace seemed like a gentle, harmless woman, but there was an air of mystery about her. As they sat down to wait for their respective flights, Ethan found himself glancing at her occasionally, wondering what stories lay behind her tired eyes. The minutes passed, and though they exchanged polite conversation, Mrs. Grace remained elusive about her life. She spoke fondly of her family, but didn't share many details. Ethan listened politely, sensing a quiet sadness behind her words. He couldn't explain why, but he felt drawn to her, as if there was something important she wasn't telling him. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan found himself truly curious about someone other than himself. As their conversation continued, he couldn't shake the feeling that this chance meeting at the airport was no coincidence. As Ethan and Mrs. Grace sat together at the gate, the usual airport noises, announcements, the hum of distant conversations, the shuffle of travelers, seemed to fade into the background. Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange curiosity about this elderly woman who had suddenly entered his day. She had a way of speaking that was both gentle and wise, and yet there was a quiet sadness to her words that he couldn't quite place. After a few moments of silence, Mrs. Grace turned to Ethan, her eyes soft but observant. "So, young man, what do you do for a living?" she asked, her voice gentle but laced with curiosity. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, smiling politely. "I run a tech company," he said. "We develop software for businesses to manage their operations more efficiently." Mrs. Grace nodded thoughtfully, but her eyes stayed on him, as if she was processing more than just his words. "A businessman, I see," she murmured. "That explains the nice suit and the busy look on your face." She chuckled lightly, but there was a knowing tone beneath her playful remark. Ethan couldn't help but smile back. "Yeah, it keeps me on my toes. Lots of travel, meetings, deals to close. It's a busy life, but I enjoy it." "And your family?" Mrs. Grace asked suddenly, catching Ethan slightly off guard. "Do they travel with you?" For a brief moment, Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to sharing personal details with strangers, especially about his family. But something about Mrs. Grace's demeanor made him feel comfortable enough to open up, if only a little. "I'm not married," he said. "No kids either. My parents passed away when I was younger. So it's just me." Mrs. Grace's expression softened, and she reached over to gently pat his hand. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said quietly. "Losing family is never easy, especially when you're still young." Ethan nodded, but he quickly steered the conversation away from the topic of his parents. "What about you?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You said you're traveling to visit family." Mrs. Grace gave a small smile, but there was a hint of something bittersweet in her eyes. "Yes, I'm going to see my family. It's been a long time since I've seen them. Too long, really." Ethan picked up on the shift in her tone, sensing that there was more to the story than she was letting on. "Why's that?" he asked gently. "If you don't mind me asking." Mrs. Grace hesitated for a moment, her eyes dropping to her hands, which were folded neatly in her lap. "Life has a way of separating people," she said after a pause. "Sometimes it's circumstances, sometimes it's choices, and sometimes, well, sometimes it's a little of both." Her words hung in the air, and Ethan could feel the weight of them. He wanted to ask more, to pry into the deeper meaning behind her cryptic response, but he wasn't sure if it was his place. Mrs. Grace was a stranger, after all, and yet she didn't feel like one. As if sensing his hesitation, Mrs. Grace turned the conversation back to him. "You said you lost your parents when you were young," she said, her voice soft but probing. "It must have been hard, building your life without them." Ethan swallowed, surprised by the directness of her question. "Yeah, it was," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But I had good mentors. I learned a lot from the people around me. I worked hard to get where I am." Mrs. Grace nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "You remind me of someone," she said, almost to herself. "Someone I knew a long time ago. Someone who was driven like you, focused on success." Ethan tilted his head slightly, curious. "Who was that?" Mrs. Grace looked away for a moment, as if lost in thought. "Oh, just a memory," she said, her voice distant. "Someone from my past. But you, there's something about you, Ethan. You have a good heart, I can tell, but you also carry a lot on your shoulders." Ethan shifted in his seat, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to people reading him so easily, especially someone he had just met. "I guess that's true," he said after a pause. "But don't we all?" Mrs. Grace smiled softly, but didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared ahead, her eyes focused on something far away, as if seeing things only she could. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like there was something unspoken between them, something important that hadn't yet surfaced. After a long pause, Mrs. Grace finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you, Ethan," she said, her tone serious now. "Something I've been holding on to for a long time." Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the air around them seemed to thicken with anticipation. He leaned in slightly, his curiosity piqued and his pulse quickening. "What is it?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent. Mrs. Grace looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotion, sadness, regret, and something else he couldn't quite place. She opened her mouth to speak, but then hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. Ethan waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say would change everything. The air around them felt heavy, almost suffocating, as Ethan leaned in closer, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Mrs. Grace took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. For a moment, Ethan thought she might change her mind, that she would brush off the comment and leave him hanging in suspense. But then she finally spoke, her voice quiet yet filled with emotion. "Ethan," she began, her eyes locking onto his, "there's something you need to know. It's something I've carried with me for many years, something I've kept hidden from everyone, until now." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew instinctively that whatever Mrs. Grace was about to reveal would alter everything. His mind raced with possibilities. Was she connected to his family somehow? Did she know his parents? A flood of questions swirled in his head, but he stayed silent, waiting. Mrs. Grace glanced down at her shaking hands, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Many years ago, when I was young, I fell in love with a man. A wonderful man, or at least I thought he was. We were inseparable, and I believed we were going to build a life together. But life, it has a way of taking things from you when you least expect it." Ethan's chest tightened, and he felt a strange sense of familiarity in her story. Something about it was tugging at him, but he couldn't yet place why. He leaned in closer, his brow furrowing as she continued. "We were together for a while, and then I found out I was pregnant." Mrs. Grace paused, her voice wavering. "I thought he would be happy that we would start a family, but instead, he left me. No explanation, no goodbye. He just disappeared." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Ethan felt a pang of sadness for this woman. Abandoned with a child on the way, forced to fend for herself. It was a story all too common, and yet, hearing it from Mrs. Grace made it feel intensely personal. But why? Why was she telling him this? Mrs. Grace wiped at her eyes, struggling to maintain her composure. "I raised that child on my own," she whispered. "A boy. I did the best I could, but it wasn't easy. We had no money, and life was a constant struggle. Still, I loved him with everything I had. He was my world." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His mind was racing now, pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed beginning to come together. He couldn't speak, couldn't interrupt her, as though some deep part of him already knew where this was going. "I tracked down the man who left us," Mrs. Grace continued, her voice a mixture of pain and bitterness. "I found him, years later, but by then it was too late. He had moved on, started a new family. He had become successful, wealthy, and he had forgotten all about me and his son." Her words struck Ethan like a punch to the gut. His heart started to race faster, his thoughts spinning. What are you trying to say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Grace met his eyes again, her gaze filled with sadness. "Ethan, that man, your grandfather, was the one who abandoned me. He left me and his son, your father." "That's right, Ethan. I am your grandmother." Ethan felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. His mind reeled, struggling to make sense of what she had just said. His grandmother. This frail, elderly woman sitting next to him, whom he had just met by chance in an airport, was claiming to be his grandmother. It was too much to process. I don't understand," Ethan stammered, his thoughts swirling in confusion. How could this be? My family never mentioned anything about you. My father never said a word." Mrs. Grace shook her head slowly, tears now streaming down her cheeks. "Your father didn't know. He never knew the truth about what his father did to us. I kept it hidden. I didn't want to burden him with the pain. So I let him believe what your family wanted him to believe, that his father was a good man, a man who cared. But the truth is much darker." Ethan sat back, his mind racing, trying to process this revelation. His grandfather had abandoned his grandmother and his father. The man he had always thought of as a distant, but honorable, figure had hidden a life of deception and betrayal. His head spun as he tried to reconcile this new information with the image he had held of his family all these years. Mrs. Grace's voice broke through his thoughts. "I didn't come here to ask for anything," she said softly. "I've lived with this pain for long enough. But I wanted you to know, Ethan. I wanted you to know the truth about where you came from." Ethan stared at her, his emotions swirling between shock, anger, and sorrow. His world had just been turned upside down, and he had no idea how to feel. Ethan sat frozen in his seat, the weight of Mrs. Grace's revelation pressing down on him like a heavy stone. His mind was racing, struggling to piece together the shattered fragments of his understanding of his family. His heart pounded in his chest, emotions swirling, anger, confusion, and disbelief. The image he had carried of his family, particularly his grandfather, had been irrevocably changed by the woman sitting beside him, a woman he now knew was his grandmother. The silence between them was thick, almost unbearable. Mrs. Grace sat quietly, her frail hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Ethan could see the pain etched in every wrinkle on her face, the pain of abandonment, the weight of years spent alone, and the burden of secrets carried for too long. "I don't know what to say," Ethan finally whispered, his voice shaky. I never knew. My father never knew. Why didn't you tell him? Why didn't you come back earlier?" Mrs. Grace looked up at him, her expression full of sorrow and regret. "I wanted to, Ethan," she said softly. "But when your father was young, I thought I was doing what was best for him. I didn't want him to grow up with the weight of that pain, the knowledge that his father had abandoned us. I thought it would be easier for him to believe that he came from a happy family, even if it was only half the truth." Ethan's chest tightened. He could understand the reasoning, but it didn't make the reality any easier to accept. "So you just stayed away all this time?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Mrs. Grace nodded slowly. "At first, I thought it was the right thing to do, but as the years passed, I regretted it more and more. I watched you from afar, Ethan. I watched as you grew up and became the successful man you are today. I saw your father become a wonderful man, even without knowing the full truth about his past. And I wanted to reach out, but I was too ashamed." "Too ashamed?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowed. "Yes," Mrs. Grace replied, her voice breaking slightly. "Ashamed that I hadn't been stronger. Ashamed that I had let fear and heartbreak keep me from being there for my son and for you. By the time I found the courage, it felt like too much time had passed. I didn't know if I could fit into your lives anymore." Ethan sat in stunned silence. He had always believed he came from a family with no dark secrets, no skeletons in the closet. But now he felt as though the foundation of his identity had cracked. His grandfather, the man who had been a distant but respectable figure in his mind, was now revealed to be someone who had walked away from his responsibilities. His grandmother had lived in the shadows, carrying the burden of a story she had never told until now. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan could feel the weight of Mrs. Grace's regret and shame, but he was also grappling with his own emotions. Part of him felt betrayed by his family for hiding this, by the past he never knew existed. Another part of him, however, felt a deep sympathy for Mrs. Grace, who had lived with so much pain and loss. Finally, he broke the silence. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with both vulnerability and strength. "Why tell me now?" Mrs. Grace sighed softly, wiping away a tear that had fallen down her cheek. "I don't want anything from you, Ethan," she said gently. "I didn't come here to ask for money or forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the truth before it was too late. I've carried this secret for so long, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving this world without you knowing where you come from." Her words struck Ethan deeply. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just an old woman, but a grandmother who had made choices she believed were right at the time, even if they had caused her immense pain. She wasn't here for a handout or to disrupt his life. She was here because she wanted to make peace with her past. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The anger that had bubbled up inside him slowly began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of compassion. He realized that this wasn't about his grandfather, or even about the lies that had been kept hidden. This was about the woman sitting in front of him, his grandmother, who had spent a lifetime wrestling with her decisions and regrets. "I don't know how to process all of this," Ethan admitted, his voice softer now. "But I'm glad you told me. I don't know where we go from here, but I don't want you to disappear again." Mrs. Grace's face softened, a small but genuine smile spreading across her lips. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I don't expect anything from you. I'm just grateful you listened." As they sat there, the noise of the bustling airport faded into the background once again. The whirlwind of emotions Ethan had been feeling began to settle, and though the journey ahead would be complicated, he felt a sense of closure, of understanding. He reached out and gently took Mrs. Grace's hand in his. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly. "Together." And for the first time in years, Mrs. Grace felt a glimmer of hope. Thanks for watching. Do well to subscribe so you don't miss a tale. Have a good time.